Hey guys, Coach Chad here. Today we're going over a couple of more things on Zone 2 heart rate training. Obviously, you know that we're opening up the Zone 2 training in the next couple of weeks, or actually this week, actually on Mother's Day, and maybe not the best start day, but that's all right. But what today we're going to do is we're going to go over one of the blog articles that I wrote a little while ago here. If you go to the Synergy Strength blog, you're going to find a whole bunch of different articles on Zone 2 training for strength sports, endurance athletes, what it is, and what it's all about and how to find it. But this one right here is going to go over in a little bit more detail as to how to actually find your appropriate Zone 2 heart rate. Typically, Zone 2 is done via heart rate. It can also be done via wattage or some kind of form of power output. You guys mostly are going to be doing running, although you are welcome to bike, run, walk, whatever it is that you want to do. So you may or may not be interested in finding all the different methods of doing this, but I want to just highlight quickly what these are. But I'm going to start down from the bottom and make our way up here. So the very first one on the screen is the perceived rate of exertion. Now, this is the easiest and the most effective method, or I shouldn't say the most effective. This is the easiest method of finding your Zone 2 and training with it. So as it's stated here, that you're going to use your rate of perceived exertion, which involves a level of 1 to 10. So this is like what I would call in weightlifting the 1 to Godzilla scale. And you're going to sit between a scale of 5 to 6. So this is a very easy level. Now, when most people start Zone 2 training, they start way too quick, way too rapidly, and they're going to be training at too high an intensity. And it's important to note that with regard to Zone 2 training, it's very important that you keep the intensity low enough so that you're actually having the appropriate response. The goal is not to go above the aerobic threshold, or what could also be termed of not producing lactate. So that burning feeling that you get in your legs, which is actually hydrogen ions and some other things like that, but what we know as lactate. You want to avoid that. If you start to produce too much lactate, you're going to be using a different energy system. You're going to be using the anaerobic system, and that's not what we're looking to do here. What we're looking to do is use the aerobic system predominantly, or at least 100% is the way you want to think about it. Okay, so you have to keep it a very low intensity. And for most of you, when you go out to do this, you're going to find that this is way, way lower than you think it might be from a perspective of intensity. Now, the goal with Zone 2 is also going to be to train for a minimum of 45 minutes, upwards of an hour and a half. But I recommend most people, when they first start, to begin somewhere around a half an hour just to get adapted, and then you can start moving up into the 45-minute range. Once you get there, then you can start to progress to a little bit longer sessions of maybe an hour or so. But this will become the minimum that we're going to want to look towards for our classes that we're running on Sundays. Okay. Now, the best way at class time to do this is to use the talk test. So, because we're doing this in a team and using camaraderie and things like that to on our side for training, the talk test might be one of the best ways to do this. And what this means is that you should be able to talk and form full sentences while still training. Now, you shouldn't be able to talk at the rate I'm talking right now. The best analogy that I've seen used was one that Peter Attia used, and he talks about the fact that I should be able to have and be able to do this conversation right now if I was on an exercise bike. But I would be at a low enough intensity that I could still talk, but you would know that I'm exercising. So if I was to give you a call right now and do this blog post and explain to you what the talk test could be, I could be doing Zone 2 training at that exact same time. You would know I'm exercising, but you wouldn't know that it would be, you would know that it wouldn't be intense exercise. That's the best way to use the talk test. And that's what you guys are mostly going to be using when you go out to train on the Sundays. Now, when we go up here a little bit more, we're going to talk about more so like some of the field tests. Now, I'm going to kind of quickly blur over this because the first two were the primary ones that you guys are going to be using. But this blog article may have been a little bit more confusing than it needed to be. But I thought just for information's sake, you can see some of the other ways of doing this. Now, some of you may know this, but I used to do a lot of Zone 2 training on the rowing machine. And I do upwards of an hour to hour and 15 on the rower. And what I would use is I would use a lactate monitor. So in this case, you'd actually have to do a field test where you'd be testing some of the stuff and you'd be testing your lactate. Now, I wouldn't allow my lactate to get over 2 millimoles. Now, this requires someone sitting there testing your lactate. Are you testing it frequently? Which, of course, is not really practical. It's also very, very expensive. The lactate monitor is around $800, and you have to have little strips, which are a couple dollars a piece. So every single time I would test this, it would become fairly expensive. But it was a more so used from my perspective of educational perspective, as well as learning a little bit more about where my levels were at. Then when I did this, I also knew my power or my wattage on the rower, which then meant I knew what I could hold and now how I could improve over time with my training. Okay. Now, another way you would be able to do this is to use heart rate. Now, if you guys, a lot of you guys have equipment, so you guys can now track this stuff. You have your Apple Watches, or you have an actual heart rate monitor, or any other version of this. Some people have the Whoop or your Fitbit. you'll be able to use these. Now, the catch with some of the stuff is that you have to have a maximal heart rate. So we're going to jump up to this first one here, which is using the maximal heart rate method. Now, the maximal heart rate method is to take your age and subtract that from 220, which I have to admit is a very, very impractical way of doing this because it is not accurate at all. But it'll give you a ballpark, a very, very rough ballpark. So if you want to track your heart rate while you go out for your first couple runs, this would be the way to do it. So I'm 40 years old. I would take 220 minus 40, which is 180. Then I would take 60 to 70% of that, whatever that works out to be. That would be 60, 126 up to 70. 136, 126 to 136, something like that, beats per minute that I would have to maintain, which is actually very, very low. But the value in doing that is to give you a guide as to where you would be sitting when you're doing this kind of training. Okay. And like I said, for most people, it's a lot lower than you think. So that 60 to 70% range could be used based on your 220 only as a guide. And then you overlap it with your talk test or your perceived rate of exertion. So you're kind of using all these varieties together. Okay. The other way you could do is maximal heart rate method would be to actually test your maximal heart rate, know what it is, because it's highly variable depending on the person, based on age, sex, training backgrounds, all those different things. So with that in mind, the best way to test your maximal heart rate would be to do it in the modality that you want to use your zone 2 in. So if you are going to run, you would do it in running. If you were going to do a bike, you could do it in biking. If you're going to row, you could do it in the rower. And this is one of the first things that I did when I started my zone 2 kind of stuff as well, is that we did this on a rowing machine. So what you would do, no matter what the modality is, you take 2 to 4 minutes of low intensity exercise, get yourself ramped up, and do a small little ramp up test. So just get the system going. Once you have 2 to 4 minutes in, then you'd start doing little ramp up tests. What I did is I did a 30-second slow, 20-second moderate, 10-second sprint. I did that for 2 to 4 more rotations. But again, getting the intensity up. Once I had done that and I'd got accustomed to the intensity, then it was 60 to 120 seconds of maximal all-out effort while you're recording your heart rate. And whatever the maximal heart rate that you find in that test is would be then correlated to your actual maximal heart rate. And this is very uncomfortable. It has to be an absolute max out, all-out effort to elicit the response from the heart rate. And once you find that, when you go back into your recordings, because you may not be able to do it at the time of doing it, when you go back in your recordings with your watch or whatever implement you're using, you would find your maximal heart rate, and then you can calculate 60, 70% of that. And then also note how close your maximum heart rate is to the 220 marker that is generally used in training. And you'll probably find it's not that close. Then the second one you could do is you could use your heart rate reserve, which is going to be a little bit more accurate as well. So in this one, you need your resting heart rate. Okay, so what you do in this one is you take your max heart rate, which could be done with a 220 minus age. Again, I want to repeat, not accurate. Or the maximum field test that you did, find your maximum heart rate and minus it, and then minus your resting heart rate, which would then have to be found in the morning. So the best way to do that was be upon waking, have your monitor on, and then just lie still for maybe 3 to 5 minutes and find your average heart rate across that period of time, or your lowest position. And that would be what you would use for your resting heart rate. Okay. So once you have your resting heart rate, you then can calculate your heart rate reserve, and then you would take your percentage of that. Okay, so that's a very different way of doing it, but that would be probably the more accurate way as well. So you have multiple ways you can find your zone 2 numbers, and you can see, and you can go back and read this post I put up as well, even though I didn't highlight all the different methods and variations within here, but it gives you a good idea and a guide. And then from there, just remember that for most of you guys, if you don't have electronics or you don't have any biofeedback work that you're getting from watches or any other external devices, your best bet is going to be the talk test and your perceived rate of exertion, kind of combining those two together. Okay. And on your first run out, I would highly recommend that you just go much, much lower than you think. And it's also important to note for some people, in order to do steady state cardio for 45 minutes, this may actually be just a fast walk or even just a walk. And that doesn't lessen the value of the training. It just means that that's where you're at within the scales of intensity. And this is very, very important to understand. Okay. So the intensity does not have to be an actual jog or run. It could be a steady state walk to maintain that heart rate. And for some people, you might find it's a very, very slow jog into a walk. Now, we don't want off and on, high intensity, low intensity. It would be a very, very subtle variation in the intensities. But, and again, over time, that would improve as you're going. So you would then improve your output, improve your intensity as you're training. And this would take weeks to months, of course, to do, but it would be well worth your time because all the reasons I've laid out in different blog articles as to what the values of Zone 2 training are for you from a performance perspective and a recovery perspective and a health perspective. Okay. So I hope that's helpful. That's a 10-minute video, so a little bit longer than I wanted, but I hope you guys got something out of that. And have fun this weekend. Enjoy, guys.